in these three meetings, these three evening meetings, I have felt for some weeks the theme that God wanted to take. I have felt that they apply actually to Hebron. Of course, they can apply obviously elsewhere too, but that God was addressing the fellowship as a whole and also us individually in particular. And that God's desire is to reveal his glory, but that before he can do so, and before he can fulfill all that he has for us, there are certain things he needs to do in our lives. And so the first message was, one thing thou lackest. And we saw how that one thing turned many away from fulfilling God's purpose for their lives. And then last night, we had that horrendous list of 31 kings. You might not remember all the 31 items, but I think there were at least some things last night that convicted us. And we realized that those 31 kings have to be slain. They come from the self-life. But tonight, this message, although very simple and something that we all know very, very well indeed, the story of Abraham and Lot, yet has become an experience, a reality to us in the past few weeks. And God met us in a very extraordinary way as we were in another nation some little time ago concerning Abraham and Lot. It dealt with me in a very real way concerning their separation. And then the Lord said, but it's only also what I want to do in Hebron, in the lives of all the saints there too. So we're going to look and see the relationship between this story to Hebron, and it's in Genesis chapter 13 and verse 18. After the separation, we find in verse 18 of chapter 13 that Abraham removed his tent, came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. And therefore it was the separation, the act of separation. After that act of separation, Abraham could come to Hebron. And whilst we are physically in the place that we call Mount Hebron, and we might be joined to Hebron as a fellowship, or we may or may not tonight, depending from where we come, yet I feel that God is saying for us to enter into the realization of the fullness of the blessings that are contained in the truth of Hebron and what God wants to do for the fellowship, there has to come this separation in our own life. And so we are going to look at the historical truths tonight to start with, and we start in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1. And the Lord said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. But prior to Genesis 12, we have Genesis 11, which gives us another view of this call. And we are introduced to the family tree of Abram. And without going into all the generations, we simply know that he was the 10th generation from Noah, and that his father was Terah. And looking at verse 27, we find Terah begat Abram, Nahor, Haran, and Haran begat Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity, in Ur of the Chaldees. Abraham and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarah, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, and the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the daughter of Iscah. But Sarah was barren, she had no child. But for our purposes, verse 31, And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarah his daughter-in-law, his son Abraham's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan, and they came unto Haran, and dwelt there, and the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. And there we see a very interesting truth, that the father believed the call of God upon his son, and therefore he went with his son towards the land of Canaan, but he took also Lot with him. And then in chapter 12, we come to this verse 1, and prior to that, the Lord had said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And then he gives the very precious promises concerning what he will do for him. But you see, he said, Get thee out from thy father's house. And if we will turn to Psalm 45 and verse 10, we see that commandment repeated in another form, but the sense and theme is the same. Psalm 45 and verse 10, Hearken, O daughter, and consider, and incline thine ear. Forget also thine own people and thy father's house. And there is not just only a question of coming out from one's own people and from thy father's house, but in verse 11, verse 10, it's not only a coming out, but it's a commandment to forget them. Because one can be in one country physically and live spiritually in another country. One can be in one town, in one situation, and yet one's mind and one's spirit almost is in another. And so this sort of forgetfulness is not only a physical separation, but it also applies to a separation of the soul and spirit. And there is, if I could say this, a deliverance from soul bondage there. A deliverance, a complete deliverance from one's own people and from one's father's house. And that is a condition to enter into verse 11. So shall the king greatly desire thy beauty, for he is thy Lord, worship thou him. Then afterwards there are all these glorious promises and experiences that follow. But there is verse 10. And without verse 10, one cannot enter into all those other promises in the succeeding verses. Now, it's exactly the same with Abraham. In chapter 12 and verse 1, you see the commandment was given, Now the Lord had said unto Abraham, Get thee out of thy country, from thy kindred, from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And then in verse 2 he said, And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And then he goes on and said, I will bless them that bless thee, curse them that curseth thee, and in thee all the families of the earth be blessed. But the condition is separation, a coming out from his father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And so we see, although Abraham received that call, it seems that Terah took command, and he took Abraham with him, and he was going to fulfill the call, and he also took Lot with him. And we find that Abraham departed, and he departed from Haran, where Terah had died. But he took also Lot, his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran. And we continue, we find that Lot then entered in to the actual land, the land of Canaan, the land of promise, with Abraham. Lot actually entered in. The father did not, but Lot actually entered in. He was, if I could say this, part and parcel with Abraham entering into the promises. But Abraham passed through the land unto the place of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. And all those names have certain signification, but I don't want to go into them tonight because we want to concentrate on the theme of what God wants to say to us. And the Lord appeared unto Abraham and said, Unto thee, or unto thy seed, will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. And so you see, the promise is now narrowed to the seed of Abraham. But Lot was not the seed of Abraham. The promises were clearly to Abraham and unto his seed. In other words, the children that he would come forth from his own bowels, they were those who were going to inherit the land. And so it was very, very clear indeed that it was a seed of Abraham that was going to inherit the land. And Lot was not of the seed of Abraham. He was not of the seed of Abraham. And now, continuing, we find that they came to Bethel and pitched there. And in verse 9, Abraham journeyed, and they were still going south. And Lot is still with him. All the time, Lot is there. They went down into Egypt because there was a famine. Lot shared in the experiences in Egypt. He was by the side of Abraham. All these experiences, these early experiences in the life of Abraham, Lot was there. Lot entered into every one of these experiences also. And then we know the story that Abraham was afraid of the Egyptians, so he said to Sarah, "Well, just say that you're my sister." And we know how God plagued Pharaoh and his house for the sake of Sarah. And then it comes to the place where Pharaoh sent Abraham away up out of Egypt. And we come to chapter 13 now. And I want you to see this. Abraham went up out of Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him into the south of the land of Israel. And Abraham was very rich in cattle and silver and gold. And he went on his journeys from the south even to Bethel, unto the place where he had previously been. And then, going on, we find also in verse 5, and Lot also, which went with Abraham, had flocks and herds and tents. So Lot too had been prospered by reason of the fact that he had been with Abraham. And so the two of them had been prospered mightily by God in these journeys, and they were together. But now we come to verse 6, which causes a separation. The land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell together. And so the prosperity of Abraham and Lot caused the trouble. The blessing of God was upon Abraham, it was upon Lot also. But the problem was that the land could not bear them. The land was intended only for the one for whom the promise had been made. And so the one who had joined himself to Abraham was now causing the trouble by reason of his prosperity. And so they could not dwell together. And then in verse 7, there was strife between the herdmen of Abraham's cattle and the herdmen of Lot's cattle. And Abraham said unto Lot, "Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdmen and thy herdmen, for we be brethren." So there was no question about it. Abraham recognized Lot as being a brother. His brother's son, but nonetheless a brother. He recognized that this man was a brother. And this is the interesting point here. You see, both were prospered, both were brethren, but one had the call and the other did not have the call. One had the vision, the other did not have the vision. And whilst both were prospered, the problem lay in the fact that one had the vision of what God had purposed, the other one did not. And because of it, there was strife. There was strife. There was strife. And so Abraham said, "Let there be no strife, I pray thee, because we are brethren." And so there we have a divine principle that God does not want strife between the brethren. Albeit one has a vision and the other doesn't. Nonetheless, there is not to be a strife between them. And so the only way to overcome this strife is to separate. There is no other way. And so, in verse 9, Abraham, who has the call, said, "Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me." If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. And so the one with the call is the one who is generous. And after all, he was the older one too. And he said to Lot, now let us separate, that there be no strife. And he said, you choose. The whole land lies before us. If you want to go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you prefer going to the right, I'll go to the left. And there you see the difference between the one who has the call and the one who hasn't got the call. Because the one who had not got the call, you see, in verse 10, lifted up his eyes, beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. And in verse 11, Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan. Now, what was the difference between the two? Well, Lot looked at the cities. He looked at the natural cities. And his eyes were attracted to the natural cities. But what about Abraham? What made Abraham so generous? In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 10, or perhaps 9 and 10, by faith he sojourned in the land of promise as in a strange country. Now that was very interesting. It was his inheritance. It was his inheritance. God had promised it to him as an inheritance, but yet he was a stranger in his own inheritance. Why? Because he was after something else. In verse 10, he looked for a city which had foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Now that is why Abraham was able to be so generous, because even in his natural inheritance, his eyes were upon something else. His eyes were upon a city that was invisible. His eyes were upon the eternal inheritance, not upon the natural inheritance. And although God had promised him that land as a natural inheritance, Abraham was like a stranger in his own inheritance because his eyes were upon an eternal reward. And there you see, you have the difference in the vision between these two men. Lot had not the heavenly vision. Lot could not see the eternal rewards. Lot could not look into the millennium. Lot could not look into the new heavens and the new earth. And therefore he clung to the natural. He believed with all his heart in the call of Abraham. Otherwise he would never have gone. And when he got into the land, then he chose for himself the best part of that land, because that's as far as his vision went. He could only see that which was earthly. He could only see the vision as being the earthly inheritance. And because of that, he clung to it. He grasped the best part of it. And so you see, you have the difference between the two men. Remember, both believed in the call. We've got to be very clear on this point. Both were willing to sacrifice everything for that call. But what indeed was the call? Well, you look at Genesis 12, and we get the impression that the call was the land. But in Hebrews, it is very evident that Abraham had caught the sight of a heavenly vision, a heavenly inheritance. And it's very clear that Abraham was after something that was eternal, whereas Lot had his eyes on the realization of the vision as being upon this earth. And so therefore to him the earthly was the thing that was all important. And how often, you see, we look around the world as we travel from country to country, and we see the lots. You see, oh, they see the call, they see the promise, they see the earthly inheritance, and therefore Their eyes are upon the earthly inheritance. Oh, that means so much to them. But when one's eyes have caught the vision, one realizes, even with the promises of God for an earthly reward, one's eyes are upon the heavenly vision. And what a difference that makes. And so we see here, as we go on, that after the separation, you see, the Lord appears in verse 14 to Abraham again. After that Lot was separated unto him, he said, Now lift up now thine eyes, look from the place where thou art, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever. And so Abraham, after being separated from Lot, God reconfirms the earthly promise, and he said, Lot may have chosen Sodom and Gomorrah, but it's really yours. And so you see, Abraham, the one with the heavenly vision, collects the earthly as well, because he hangs so lightly to it. His eyes are on something else. And therefore, from that point onwards, the Lord said, well, why don't you walk? In verse 17, arise and walk through the land in the length of it, in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. And then Abraham removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron. And that is what God dealt with me so strongly concerning, that there has to be a separation from Lot before we can get into the spiritual significance of Hebron. And as I said, this was a very real experience for us a little time ago when God released us from some responsibilities, from some relationships that he had caused us to enter into. And I'm rather of the opinion, that going with Lot was also in the plan of God for a very real reason, for it illustrates a truth. Because, you see, there are those who come with us, perhaps for the fellowship. Perhaps they are a help to us and an encouragement at times, that it can well be in the will of God that they come with us for a time, but there comes a time when God says, now in order to enter in to the fullness of the inheritance that I have for you, just give them all and come and follow me. And so we've just gone through something like that, but it was so interesting. You see, one morning, it was just as though the hand of God came upon me, and he said, now I've separated you from Lot so that you can enter into what I have for you. But then he said, it's not just for you. He said, it is the message for each one at the convention. So you can forget about us. You can think about yourself. All right. Now then, we're going to have a look at Lot a little bit more. Now, who is this Lot? You see, we want to look at Lot very carefully, because you see, the question that we're going to ask at the end is this: who is Lot? Who is your Lot? See, that is the question. Who is your Lot? From whom must you be separated? Now, it can be from a person, but it can also be from a desire, because Lot can be on the inside as well as on the outside. And so we want to look at Lot very carefully indeed. Well, first of all, he was a relative, and we know all about relatives. But you notice, you see, this sort of relative, well, it can be in the natural, but it can also be in the spiritual. We'll look at that a bit later on. Lot, who was Lot? Well, Peter said he was a righteous man, a righteous man. We're not dealing with a sinner. We're dealing with a righteous man. Whatever anybody else thinks about him, the Word of God says he was a righteous man, a righteous man. who simply hated the immorality of Sodom and Gomorrah. He was a righteous man, but he was carnal. You know, it's possible to be a righteous man. This is what some do not understand. There's a difference between righteousness and holiness. Righteousness is to have principles. Righteousness is to have a standard. Righteousness is to determine to walk on a pathway that is pleasing to God. But you see, as has already been brought out by Pastor Norton, this evening, those kings, many of those kings were righteous men, but they weren't holy men. What is the difference between righteousness and holiness? Well, holiness involves separation. It is to be separate from that which is evil and separated from the world, flesh, and the devil, and to be separated unto God. A righteous man is simply one who has principles, but he can have a lot of other things in him too. And so here was Lot, a righteous man, though carnal. He was essentially one who had not got the call. He had not got the call, though he aligned himself with a call of another. And there you have the thought of one who is joined to you to fulfill a call, but hasn't got the call. And sooner or later, prosperity and blessing are going to cause trouble. There was no problem as long as they were poor. The problem came when they got rich and got blessed. He hadn't got the call, so in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 7, there was no grace for him. You see, there is grace given according to the call. Grace means divine enablement to fulfill the call. And there is no grace given unless the call has first been given. And one cannot expect one who has not got the call to fulfill a call. And that is why we have to be always so very, very careful indeed and examine first the call. Because unless the call is there, there is no grace to fulfill the call. That is why the call has to be constantly tested in our lives, because if we try and undertake something for which we are not called, there is no grace to fulfill that call in our lives. And we cannot expect another to enter into our call unless they have the same call, because there is no grace given to do it. Now let's have a look at something else about him. Well, he was a very interesting person indeed. You see, he looked with his own eyes and chose his inheritance according to his eyes. According to the natural, he chose his inheritance. How unwise that was. Let's think of the cost that Lot had to pay. The cost was phenomenal. After this separation, we find in chapter 14 the first recorded war in the Word of God. And we're told that here were some people who served the kings of Babylon and Persia and so forth, and that because there was rebellion against them, then these kings came down and they took captive the king of Sodom and the king of Gomorrah. And not only that, but they took Lot also captive with his goods and so forth. And so the result of this choice brought captivity, almost a Babylonish captivity. He fell into Babylon, into Babylonian captivity. And so often that is the case in the ministry and in Christian life. If we go according to the sight of our eyes and we make choices according to our eyes, those choices will eventually end up in Babylon. And we've got to watch this very carefully indeed. What is Babylon? Well, Babylon is idolatry. Babylon is another spirit. And here was Lot. He was captured by the king of Babylon and some of the other kings too, the king of Shinar. And so you see the danger. Now what happened? Well, he had to be rescued. He had to be rescued. And he was rescued by Uncle Abraham. And Uncle Abraham had what Lot did not have. It's very interesting. In verse 14, Abraham had trained servants born in his own house, 318. Lot did not have any army to defend him. Lot did not have any company with him. Lot was a loner, away from the purposes of God. And so he had to be delivered by the one who had carefully trained an army of 300, meaning walking with God, and 18, meaning strength. And Abraham comes and delivers Lot. That's the first captivity of Lot. It's a big price to pay when you choose with your own eyes. Captivities follow. You remember the children of Israel of old, that God said to them, you are to cross over Jordan and go into your inheritance that I have provided for you. But the 2.5 tribes that elected to choose their inheritance by reason of their eyes on the wrong side of Jordan, God said, you'll go into captivity. You'll be the first to go into captivity. And so you see, there is an enormous price to pay when we choose our inheritance with the seeing of our eyes. The cost is phenomenal. It is captivity. Well, if that wasn't bad enough, there's another price he has to pay. He gets out of that. He gets delivered from Babylon. But you see, you've got to be careful where you dwell spiritually. Because in the book of Revelation, in the chapter 18, and perhaps we could turn to it just for a moment, we see again Babylon. And as we shall see in the study of Revelation and Daniel and so forth, Babylon is not only a city, a historical city, but it is the source of the false church and all false religion. It comes from Nimrod. And in Revelation chapter 18, we see Babylon, which is Rome here, obviously. And there is a remark here in Revelation chapter 18, in verse 4, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. There is an awesome price to pay if you are choosing your inheritance with your own eyes, because the eyes are the last things to trust, because the eyes appreciate that which is pleasant, the eyes appreciate that which is earthly, and so the eyes will naturally go to an earthly inheritance or a fleshly inheritance. And Lot, likewise, he went to Sodom and Gomorrah, and these were cities that were under the judgment or coming judgment of God. And so you see in Revelation chapter 18, this thought of spiritual Babylon. God says, come out of her, my people, lest ye be partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. Now, Lot had the strength and the fortitude not to partake of the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah, but one thing he could not escape from, and that was the judgment upon Sodom and Gomorrah, because he was dwelling in the place that God had ordained for judgment. And it's so important to understand this, that if we are in an alliance with those whom God has ordained for judgment, unless we get out, we come under the judgment of those people even though perhaps we don't agree with them. And so Lot's sufferings really stemmed from the fact that he was dwelling in the wrong place with the wrong people. And the interesting thing about Lot is this, that he simply hated what they were doing. He didn't agree with them. He was at constant odds with them. In fact, the people of the city knew that and complained that he reproved them constantly. And yet he stayed there. And it's amazing how people can dwell in a place and amongst a people with whom they do not agree. Their righteous indignation is manifested almost every day, and yet, bless my soul, they don't hear the word of God which says, come out from among them. They somehow are content to dwell with people that they do not agree with. What an awesome situation that is. And yet, with Lot, we see it. In the book of Revelation, we see it. Because it's clear that God says, come out of her, my people. And so it's very clear indeed that God has people who elect by choice to dwell in Babylon. There are people who elect by choice to dwell amongst the Sodomites, even though they disagree with them. It's almost, what shall I say? Something that is beyond our comprehension. Why people dwell with those whom they do not agree with and are at constant odds with them, and yet they don't make the simple step of remedy by coming out from them. Why Lot continued in Sodom and Gomorrah is beyond our comprehension. He was stirred up, his soul was vexed constantly, we're told by Peter. He simply hated their evil practices. Why didn't he get out? Well, there was something else holding him. It was the natural blessing that they were enjoying. And so often, you see, it is for natural reasons that one stays in a place that one does not agree with. And yet, look at the price that one has to pay. God says in Revelation chapter 18, you're running a tremendous risk if you keep staying with them, because if you're not careful, you'll be partakers of their sins. There are very few people like Lot who can dwell in a place that is wicked and constantly fight them and not be succumbed with their wickedness. But like it or not, one comes under the plagues of the people and the judgment of the people with whom one dwells. It's an awesome situation. And so we see the fact that he was taken prisoner, but then comes the next point, God's judgment upon these people. And it is the Lord's mercy that Lot is again delivered, because the Lord makes known to Abraham the plight of Sodom and Gomorrah. He makes known unto Abraham the fact that he is coming down to judge and to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And because of this revelation, then God opens up the door for Abraham again to be a deliverer for Lot, this time by intercession. And so he starts to plead for Lot as God appears to him in chapter 18. And so he intercedes for Lot. Lot shouldn't have been there, but he interceded for Lot. And then in chapter 19, we find there came two angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom, and Lot, seeing them, rose up to meet them. He bowed himself with his face toward the ground. What discernment the man still had. He could tell that these two men were angels. They certainly didn't have wings upon them. but he could discern that they were angels. They weren't men. He had discernment. Discernment was still in him. The discernment of right and wrong in certain aspects. And he said, tarry now, I pray thee, with me. And we know this story, so there's no need to go on to it. And then they tell him, we have come to judge. And again, they make it very clear indeed. And in verse 12, they said, the men said unto Lot, hast thou here any besides son-in-law, thy sons, thy daughters, whatsoever thou hast in the city, bring them out of this place, for we will destroy this place, because the cry of them is waxed great before the face of the Lord, and the Lord hath sent us to destroy it. And Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-law, who had married his daughters, and said, up, get you out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. And when the morning arose, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, arise, take thy wife, and thy 2 daughters which are here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. And while he lingered, that man never wanted to leave Sodom and Gomorrah. He had an attachment there that was so strong that it was almost willing to risk divine judgment to stay. And look, while he lingered, the men laid hold upon his hand, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful unto him, and they brought him forth, and set him without the city. In other words, it was angelic visitation that brought Lot out of that city. Nothing else could have brought him out. He lingered. My, who would linger when you know the thing is going up in smoke? But Lot did. Oh, his heart, his whole being was rooted in Sodom and Gomorrah. And yet he hated them. And yet he hated them. And yet he hated them. And how often we have seen that people say, I can never leave, I can never leave, I can never leave. My roots are there. My roots are there. My roots are there. We've had some very interesting experiences just recently of people returning to their roots. People returning to their roots. As will happen, people do things differently. People have a different way of presenting certain truths from the Bible. And so his roots then grew strong and started to contradict in his mind what was being taught by the others. There's another minister living in the same city, not far away. He was visited in an extraordinary way by God. God visited him in his church, and he opened up his church to the charismatic movement. In fact, he is an article written about him in a certain book, which I won't mention, else you'll know who I'm talking about. And the result was he became lifted up in God. He became a blessing. His church grew. His name became known nationally, and the blessing of God was upon him. But he never dealt with his roots either. And the result was, when it came time to retire, you see, he was taken from that church, that particular church, but he hadn't dealt with his roots. And so he slipped back into, I can't mention what denomination, but anyway, completely lost out the blessing. And this has happened just recently in a certain country, and God has been saying, the roots have to be taken out, because a person returns to their roots. And so, you see, we have to examine our roots. Where are our roots? God is very clear-cut. He said, forget thy father's house. It's not just a coming out. You see, these brethren came out. They came out. But you see, they did not forget. And the power of the mind is so great that though physically out, they were still joined by their mind and in their soul. And that power is tremendous. It is greater than any physical power, and it brought them back to their roots, to their roots. How important it is that we allow God to take out of us our roots. Because if not, sooner or later, the strength will be so great that we will return to our roots. We will return to our roots. And so that is one of the truths tonight that is so very important indeed. We will return unto our roots. Where were Lot's roots? Well, where had Lot come from? Lot had come from Babylon. He had come from the Ur of the Chaldees. His roots were situated in Babylon. And what is Babylon? Babylon is covetousness. Babylon is another spirit. And so you see what happened. He went back into captivity once because of his roots. And he got delivered by Abraham. And then here, God, having mercy upon him, pulls him away from his roots. Roots in Sodom and Gomorrah? Certainly, because Babylon speaks of covetousness, and that was Lot's problem. And so you see that root from Babylon, from the Ur of the Chaldees, that root he never got rid of. And so eventually it mastered him. The end of Lot was very sad. His wife was in an equally sad position. She looked back and became a pillar of salt and became a sign to all generations of those who look back towards that which their soul lusteth after. I knew a girl in another church, and she had a dream. It was a dream of the second coming. And here was the second coming, and the power of God was upon earth, and she was lifted up to go to be with the Lord. And she was going towards heaven. And she said her eyes then turned towards earth, and she started to go back again. You see how important it is. I feel God is speaking to us in a very singular way tonight concerning those roots. If the roots are not dealt with, sooner or later they'll master us as they did Lot. And so the result was Lot lost his wife, Lot lost his married daughters, and all he came out with were unmarried daughters, and we know the result of that. There was incest, and there were two children that should never have been born, Ammon and Moab. And there we have the seed of Lot and the seed of Abraham. And their seeds are at conflict right until the days of the second coming. And some of the most awesome judgments, as you study the second coming scriptures, are upon the seed of Lot. It's awesome. You will see that the bloodbath, when the Lord descends upon the Mount of Olives, is through Moab and Ammon. Modern day Jordan. Brethren, they will say. They're even friendly. The king of Jordan goes across, doesn't make a scene about it, but he goes across Jordan to confer with the Israeli government at night, of course, and then he comes back, and then he speaks something against them, obviously, but nonetheless, he goes and visits them, and they confer and so forth. Oh, we be brethren. We be brethren. Yes, we be brethren. But oh, the result is terrible. What is God saying to us tonight? I feel in a very real sense that God is saying that we must be separate from Lot. Now the question is, who is Lot in our lives? It's one thing to know who the Lot was in our lives. And God has separated us from that. But the question that we have to ask ourselves tonight, what is God saying to us individually? What is God saying to us individually? The question that I've had over and over again in the Spirit, and I've been asking the Lord, who is Lot? And I felt it was not, I wasn't going to get the answer. The answer was going to be given to you. That you are to ask God, who is the Lot in my life? Who is the Lot in my life? Now, as I said before, the Lot can be like Abraham and Lot. It can be an individual that has walked with you, but there comes a time when God says there has to be a separation. And if you're walking with God, God arranges so beautifully that separation, and he arranges it so beautifully for Abraham, but the one who loses out is Lot. And the key to be able to have that separation is to have the vision that Abraham had, not of the earthly inheritance, but of the heavenly inheritance. And when you've got your eyes upon the heavenly, then you can hold so lightly the promises that God has made to you pertaining to this earth. And so Abraham could hold that so lightly that he could say to Lot, you can choose anywhere you want. So looking at Lot as being a person, then it is God who will have to reveal that to you, and it is God who will arrange the separation. But I feel also that God is speaking of an interior Lot, a Lot who hasn't dealt with his roots. And as I've given 2 illustrations, and regretfully I could give more illustrations tonight, but I won't do so, of returning to one's roots. And this is what God, I believe, is saying to some of us here tonight. There must be a forgetfulness, a holy forgetfulness, that we forget our Father's house. We forget our Father's house. We forget our roots, that the separation from our roots is so complete that it is removed even from our mind. And this is very important indeed, because, you see, one always reverts to one's roots. So the second thing is this. It is the interior Lot that can be so very, very costly to us indeed. The roots in our life that have not been cut out, because they grow again, and they come to such power within us that they will master us and bring us back to where we started. So it's very serious indeed tonight. I feel that, I don't know who is here tonight, obviously, to whom God is speaking, but you see, this message is a message that God has given me over weeks, and it seems to me to be of such importance that it's going to cost some their inheritance if they don't deal with Lot. Now, it is for you to ask the Lord, who is my Lot? Who is my Lot? Because before Abraham could come to Hebron, he had to be separated from Lot. And therefore, before we can enter into the blessings that Hebron symbolizes, there has to be a separation from Lot. It is of the utmost importance that we ask God, who is Lot in our lives? Because unless we come to grips with that, we are never going to enter in to the blessings that God has for us. The promises were renewed. Abraham started to enter into the fullness of the promises after there was a separation from Lot.
So it's very important indeed. It can cost us our inheritance, because either Lot becomes the foremost person in our life, or it is the nature of Abraham. The two cannot continue to dwell together. The question that we have to ask is this: who is Lot? Lord, reveal the Lot, so that there might be a separation, so that the Abrahamic part of my life might continue, and I might enter in to all that you have for me. 3 messages these 3 nights. They are virtually on the same theme in different settings, but I believe this is the greatest because it's the most difficult. You see, a person can disagree yet remain. Oh, beloved, are we going to pay the price Lot paid? You see, Lot had a seed, but the seed he produced was condemned by God. Beloved, we want a seed that is blessed by God, because the inheritance is in the seed. Which seed are we going to produce?